You're the reason my son settled for less than he deserved." Those words hit me like a physical blow as I stood in Patricia Henderson's pristine kitchen, holding a platter of enchiladas I'd spent all morning making. The annual family achievement. Dinner was in full swing on her covered patio, and there I was, once again being reminded that I didn't measure up. But what happened next, when my 8-year-old son Lucas found his father's hidden journal and decided to read it aloud to the entire family gathering, changed everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Rodriguez Henderson, and this is the story of how one family dinner turned my world completely upside down. For 6 years, I'd been married to David Henderson, and for 6 years, I'd been trying to prove to his mother, Patricia, that I was worthy of her precious son. Patricia, or Pat as she insisted everyone call her, was the kind of woman who wore her disapproval like expensive jewelry, subtle but unmistakably present. That evening in late May started like every other Henderson family gathering, with me walking on eggshells and Pat finding new ways to remind me that I wasn't the daughter-in-law she'd envisioned. The occasion was her annual family achievement dinner, a tradition she'd started years before I joined the family. It was supposedly a celebration of everyone's accomplishments over the past year, but it felt more like a performance review where I consistently received the lowest marks. I'd arrived early to help with preparations, carrying a casserole dish filled with my grandmother's enchilada recipe. The same recipe that had won me compliments at every other gathering I'd attended, but somehow never seemed to impress the Henderson family. As I walked through Pat's front door, I was immediately struck by how everything in her home seemed to gleam with perfection. The marble floors reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through oversized windows, and fresh white orchids adorned every surface. Even her family photos looked professionally staged, each frame positioned with mathematical precision. "Emma, you're here," Pat said, appearing from the dining room wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and pearls that probably cost more than my monthly salary as an elementary school teacher. She glanced at my dish with the kind of polite smile that never reached her eyes. "I hope you didn't make it too spicy this time. You know how Robert's stomach reacts to all that ethnic seasoning." I forced a smile and nodded, even though I'd specifically toned down the spices for previous gatherings. And even though Pat knew perfectly well that my food had never caused anyone any digestive issues. This was just her way of establishing the hierarchy from the moment I walked through her door. I was the outsider, the one who needed to adapt and modify herself to fit into their world. The house was already buzzing with activity. David's sister, Caroline, had flown in from Denver with her husband and twin daughters, and his brother Michael was there with his wife Jennifer and their teenage son. Pat's neighbors, the Washingtons, were also invited, along with David's Uncle Frank and Aunt Mary. It was the kind of gathering where everyone seemed to know their role except me. I found David on the patio, arranging chairs around the long outdoor table that Pat had decorated with crystal glasses and white linens. He looked handsome in his navy button-down shirt, his dark hair slightly tousled from the Arizona breeze. When he saw me, his face lit up with the kind of genuine warmth that had made me fall in love with him 7 years ago. "Hey, beautiful," he said, pulling me into a quick hug. "How was your day? Did the kids behave at school?" "The usual chaos," I replied, leaning into his embrace for just a moment. Tommy Martinez tried to convince me that his dog ate his math homework, and Sarah Kim spent 15 minutes explaining why she should get extra credit for drawing horses in the margins of her essay. David laughed, and for a brief moment, I felt like myself again. Not the inadequate daughter-in-law or the woman who would never be good enough, just Emma, talking to her husband about her day. But then Pat's voice cut through our conversation, like a blade. "David, sweetheart, could you help me with the wine selection? I want to make sure we have something sophisticated enough for the Washingtons." She appeared beside us, somehow managing to position herself between David and me without seeming obvious about it. "Emma, would you mind checking on Lucas? He's been awfully quiet, and you know how he gets when he's left alone too long." The implication was clear. While David helped with the important adult tasks, I should tend to child-related responsibilities. Never mind that Lucas was perfectly well-behaved and had been quietly playing in David's old room upstairs. Never mind that I'd been teaching children for 8 years and knew perfectly well how to manage a single 8-year-old boy. "Of course," I said, swallowing my irritation. "I'll go find him." As I walked back into the house, I could hear Pat's voice floating through the patio doors. "I just worry that he's not reaching his full potential, you know? When I think about where he could have been by now if he'd married someone who really understood ambition." My cheeks burned as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. This was nothing new. Pat had been making similar comments for years, always just quiet enough that David didn't quite hear them, always delivered with enough plausible deniability that I couldn't call her out without seeming oversensitive. According to Pat's narrative, I was the anchor holding David back from greatness. Never mind that he'd been promoted twice since we'd been married. Never mind that he'd started his own consulting business on the side. Never mind that he seemed happier and more confident than he'd ever been. In Pat's version of reality, these achievements had happened despite me, not because of our partnership. I found Lucas in David's childhood bedroom, which Pat had preserved like a shrine to her son's youth. Sports trophies lined the shelves, and photos of David in various academic and athletic pursuits covered the walls. Lucas was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by what looked like loose papers and a leather-bound notebook. "Hey, buddy," I said, settling down beside him on the floor. "What have you found up here?" Lucas looked up at me with his father's brown eyes, his dark hair falling across his forehead in the same stubborn cowlick that David had fought with since childhood. "I was looking for colored pencils in Dad's old desk, and I found this book," he said, holding up the leather notebook. "It has your name in it a lot, Mom." My heart skipped a beat. David had always been private about his writing, mentioning occasionally that he liked to journal, but never sharing the contents with me. I'd respected his privacy, figuring everyone deserved a space for their private thoughts. But seeing my name scattered across the pages in David's familiar handwriting made me curious and nervous in equal measure. "Buddy, that's Daddy's private writing," I said gently. "We shouldn't be reading other people's journals." "But Mom," Lucas said, his voice taking on the earnest tone that meant he was about to share something important. "He wrote really nice things about you. Like really, really nice things. And Grandma Pat is always saying not nice things about you, so I thought maybe she should hear the nice things instead." Before I could respond, Lucas was already flipping through the pages, his finger tracing along lines of text. "Look, here? He wrote about how you stayed up all night when I had that fever, and how you sang to me even though your voice was all scratchy from being sick too. And here's a part about how you helped him practice his presentation for work, and how he got that big promotion because you believed in him." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes as I watched my son carefully reading his father's words. David had never shared these observations with me directly, never told me how much he appreciated the small daily acts of love and support that I'd thought had gone unnoticed. "And Mom," Lucas continued, turning to a page near the middle of the notebook, "there's this whole part about how Grandma Pat is wrong about you, and how you're the best thing that ever happened to our family." The sound of laughter drifted up from the patio below, where the rest of the family was gathering for dinner. I could hear Pat's voice above the others, probably regaling everyone with stories of David's childhood achievements or Caroline's latest promotion. In a few minutes, we'd be called down to take our places at the table, where I'd sit quietly and smile while Pat subtly undermined me throughout the meal. But Lucas was looking at me with such earnestness, clutching his father's journal like it contained the secrets of the universe. Mom, can I show everyone what Dad really thinks about you? Because I don't think Grandma Pat knows how special you are. I hesitated, torn between my desire to respect David's privacy and my curiosity about what he'd written. More than that, I was exhausted from years of pretending that Pat's comments didn't hurt, of accepting her version of reality where I was the disappointing addition to an otherwise perfect family. What exactly did Daddy write? I asked softly. Lucas flipped to a page that looked well-worn, as if David had returned to it multiple times. In his clear 8-year-old voice, he began to read. I used to think I knew what love looked like because my mother showed me what she called love growing up. But Emma taught me the difference between conditional approval and unconditional acceptance. She loves me not because of what I achieve or how I make her look to others, but because of who I am when nobody's watching. The words hit me like a revelation. David had seen what I'd been experiencing all these years. He'd understood the difference between his mother's conditional love and what we'd built together. Lucas continued reading, his voice gaining confidence. Every day with Emma makes me a better man. She doesn't try to change me or mold me into someone else's expectations. She sees my potential and helps me reach it without ever making me feel inadequate if I fall short. I wish my mother could understand that Emma isn't holding me back from greatness. She's the reason I believe I'm capable of it. By the time Lucas finished reading that entry, tears were streaming down my face. David had not only seen my worth, he'd been documenting it, capturing moments and feelings that I'd assumed were invisible to everyone else. Mom, are you crying because you're happy or sad? Lucas asked, reaching over to pat my hand with the unconscious gentleness that made my heart swell with pride for the little boy we'd raised. Happy tears, baby, I managed to say. These are definitely happy tears. From downstairs, Pat's voice rang out, calling everyone to dinner. Dinner is served. Everyone come find your seats. Lucas stood up, still clutching the journal. Mom, I really think everyone should hear what Dad wrote about you, especially Grandma Pat. Maybe if she knew how much Dad loves you, she'd be nicer. I looked at my son, this brave little boy who'd stumbled upon evidence of his parents' love story and wanted to share it with the world. Part of me wanted to protect David's privacy, to tuck the journal back into his desk drawer and pretend we'd never found it. But a bigger part of me was tired of being the only one who knew the truth about our marriage, tired of letting Pat's narrative go unchallenged. Okay, I said, surprising myself with the decision. But we'll ask Daddy first, okay? If he says, it's all right, then you can share what he wrote. Lucas nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of what we were considering. Together, we walked downstairs toward the patio, where the rest of the Henderson family was settling into their seats around Pat's perfectly set table. The stage was set for what would turn out to be the most important family dinner of my life. As we stepped onto the patio, I caught David's eye across the crowded table. He smiled at me, that same warm smile that had carried me through 6 years of family gatherings where I'd felt like an outsider. Little did he know that his son was about to turn his private thoughts into public validation, or that his carefully guarded words were about to reshape our family dynamics forever. Pat had already launched into her traditional opening remarks, thanking everyone for coming and beginning to list the various achievements that would be celebrated that evening. But I wasn't listening to her words anymore. Instead, I was watching Lucas, who was still holding his father's journal, waiting for the right moment to speak up. Everything was about to change, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt ready for it. The Henderson family dinner table looked like something from a home design magazine. Patricia had outdone herself with the presentation, using her finest china and crystal glasses that caught the early evening light filtering through the mesh covering of her patio. White roses floated in shallow glass bowls between platters of roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and an array of side dishes that looked almost too perfect to disturb. Everyone had found their assigned seats, marked by small cream-colored cards written in Patricia's precise calligraphy. I sat between Lucas and David's Uncle Frank, directly across from Patricia, who had positioned herself at the head of the table like a queen holding court. David was seated to his mother's right, with his sister Caroline beside him. The conversation flowed easily around topics I'd heard discussed at every Henderson gathering, centered around career advancement, property investments, and the achievements of various family members. "Caroline, tell everyone about your promotion," Patricia said, beaming with pride as she gestured toward her daughter. "Senior vice president at 34. I always knew she'd be running companies before she turned 40. Caroline smiled graciously, launching into a detailed account of her new role overseeing marketing strategies for a major telecommunications company. Her success was genuine and impressive, and I found myself genuinely happy for her accomplishments. Caroline had always been kind to me, never joining in her mother's subtle criticisms, though she'd never actively defended me either. And Michael, Patricia continued, turning her attention to her younger son. "How's the law practice? I heard you took on that case for the city council." Michael straightened in his chair, clearly pleased to have his mother's attention. "It's going well, Mom. We're representing 3 major developers in the downtown renovation project. If everything goes according to plan, we're looking at a 7-figure settlement." The conversation continued in this vein, with Patricia masterfully orchestrating a symphony of family accomplishments. David shared news about his recent client acquisition. Uncle Frank discussed his retirement investment portfolio, and even the teenage cousins were invited to talk about their academic achievements and college plans. I noticed that throughout these discussions, Patricia's eyes would occasionally drift toward me, as if she were calculating when and how to work me into the conversation. I'd learned over the years that my inclusion in these family recaps was rarely flattering. She had a talent for framing my contributions in ways that highlighted their limitations rather than their merits. "Emma teaches 3rd grade," she would say with a particular emphasis that made it sound like a temporary hobby rather than a chosen career. Or, "Emma's school is in one of those challenging districts," which sounded sympathetic but carried an undertone, suggesting I couldn't secure a position somewhere more prestigious. Lucas had been unusually quiet throughout dinner, picking at his chicken and stealing glances at the leather journal he'd placed on the ground beside his chair. I could sense his growing restlessness, the way children get when they have something important to share but are waiting for the right moment. Several times he started to speak, then seemed to think better of it, looking between his father and his grandmother with an expression that suggested he was working up courage. David noticed his son's behavior too. "You okay, buddy? You're not eating much." "I'm fine, Dad," Lucas replied, but his voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for an 8-year-old. "I just have something I want to say, but I don't know when would be good." Patricia's attention immediately focused on Lucas with the kind of indulgent smile she reserved for her grandchildren. "Well, sweetheart, what is it? You know you can share anything with your family." Lucas glanced at me, and I gave him an encouraging nod. We'd agreed downstairs that he would ask his father's permission first, but I could see in his eyes that he was struggling with how to begin. "Dad," Lucas said carefully, "you know how you write in that book sometimes? The one in your old room?" David's expression shifted slightly, confusion replacing the casual dinner conversation demeanor. "What book, Lucas?" "The leather one with all the writing about Mom and our family," Lucas continued, his voice gaining strength. "I found it when I was looking for colored pencils earlier." A flush crept up David's neck, and I could see him processing the implications of his son's discovery. The journal wasn't meant to be secret exactly, but it clearly contained private thoughts he hadn't planned to share publicly. "Lucas," David said gently, "that's my personal writing. It's not really meant for other people to read." "But Dad," Lucas pressed on, his 8-year-old logic taking over, "you wrote such nice things about Mom, and sometimes people say not nice things about her, so I thought maybe they should hear the nice things instead." The table fell silent. except for the gentle clink of ice settling in water glasses and the distant sound of Patricia's neighbor running a lawnmower. Every adult present seemed to understand that we were approaching a moment that could shift the entire dynamic of the gathering. Patricia's smile had frozen in place, the kind of expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What kind of not nice thing, sweetheart?" Lucas looked directly at his grandmother with the unflinching honesty that only children possess. "Like when you said Mom was the reason Dad settled for less than he deserved. And when you said she doesn't understand ambition. And when you said she holds Dad back from being great." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face went through several expressions, from surprise to embarrassment to something that looked like carefully controlled anger. David was staring at his mother with an expression I'd never seen before, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "I never said those things," Patricia began, but her voice lacked conviction. "You did, Grandma Pat," Lucas continued, with the persistence of a child who knows he's telling the truth. "You said them when you thought nobody was listening. But I was listening, and Mom was listening too, and it made her sad." David turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and growing understanding. "Emma, is this true? Has my mother been saying things like this to you?" I felt trapped between honesty and diplomacy, aware that whatever I said next would irrevocably change our family relationships. For years, I'd absorbed Patricia's comments in silence, partly to keep peace and partly because I'd convinced myself that confronting them would only make things worse. "David," I said softly, "I didn't want to create problems between you and your mother." "That's not what I asked," David replied, his voice taking on a firmness I rarely heard. "I asked if she's been saying these things to you." Before I could answer, Lucas spoke up again. "Dad, can I read what you wrote about Mom? Because I think everyone should know what you really think about her." David looked at his son, then at me, then around the table at his family members who were all watching this scene unfold with varying degrees of discomfort and fascination. I could see him weighing his options, balancing his desire for privacy against his son's obvious need to defend his mother. "What did I write, Lucas?" David asked quietly. Lucas reached down and picked up the journal, flipping through pages, until he found the section he wanted. "You wrote about how Mom stayed up all night when I was sick, even though she was getting sick too, and how she helped you practice for your big presentation, and how you got promoted because she believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself." Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "David, surely you don't need to air your private thoughts at a family dinner." "Why not?" David asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was genuinely curious about his mother's objection. "If Lucas found something I wrote about Emma, and it contradicts what you've been telling her, maybe we should hear it." Caroline leaned forward slightly, her expression suggesting she was beginning to understand the undercurrents that had been present at these gatherings for years. "What exactly did you write, David?" David extended his hand toward his son. "May I have the journal, Lucas?" Lucas handed over the leather-bound book, and David flipped through several pages before finding what he was looking for. He was quiet for a long moment, reading silently, and I could see his jaw tighten as he processed his own words in the context of what Lucas had revealed about his mother's comments. "This is from about 6 months ago," David said finally, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of emotion. "I wrote this after Emma stayed up until 3 a.m. helping me prepare for the Morrison client presentation, the one that ended up bringing in our biggest account." He began to read aloud, and his voice filled the quiet patio space. "I used to think success meant impressing other people, meeting their expectations, and achieving goals that looked good from the outside. But Emma has taught me that real success is about becoming the person you're meant to be, not the person others want you to be. She doesn't love me because of my accomplishments or my potential earnings. She loves me because of who I am when I'm tired, when I'm worried, when I'm not at my best." Patricia's face had gone pale, and she was staring at her son as if he were speaking a foreign language. David continued reading. My mother always told me I needed to find someone who would push me to be better, someone who would challenge me to reach higher. But she misunderstood what that kind of partnership looks like. Emma doesn't push me by criticizing my shortcomings or comparing me to others. She pushes me by believing in me so completely that I start to believe in myself. Uncle Frank cleared his throat softly, and I could see that several people around the table were beginning to look uncomfortable, not because of what David was saying, but because of what it implied about Patricia's behavior toward me. There's more, David said, flipping to another page. This is from last month, after that dinner where Mom made that comment about Emma not understanding what it takes to get ahead in the world. My heart started beating faster. I remembered that evening. Clearly, Patricia had been discussing David's career prospects and had suggested that successful men needed wives who understood the importance of networking and social climbing. She looked directly at me while saying that some people were content with mediocrity and didn't understand the sacrifices required for real success. I wrote, David continued, that Emma understands success better than anyone I know, because she measures it in terms of the lives she touches rather than the money she makes. She chose to teach in a school where half the kids qualify for free lunch because she believes every child deserves someone who sees their potential. She could have taken a job in a wealthier district with better resources, but she wanted to work where she could make the biggest difference. Patricia finally found her voice. David, I think you're misunderstanding what I said that night. Am I? David asked, looking directly at his mother. Because according to Lucas, you've been making comments like this for years, and Emma has been dealing with them alone. The weight of his words settled over the table like a heavy blanket. I could see family members exchanging glances, beginning to piece together patterns they'd perhaps noticed but never fully understood. Caroline was looking at me with something that might have been recognition, as if she were remembering previous family gatherings through a new lens. Michael's wife Jennifer spoke up for the first time during the entire conversation. Emma, I had no idea you were dealing with this. I always thought you were just naturally quiet at family gatherings. She is quiet, Patricia said quickly, as if trying to regain control of the narrative. I just sometimes worry that David needs someone more. More what? David interrupted, his voice sharp. More like what you think a wife should be? More concerned with appearances than substance? More willing to sacrifice authenticity for social status? The tension at the table was palpable now. Lucas, who had started this entire conversation, was watching the adults with wide eyes, perhaps beginning to understand that he'd unleashed something much bigger than he'd anticipated. But David wasn't finished. He turned to another page in his journal and continued reading. Emma makes me want to be a better man, not because she demands it or criticizes me when I fall short, but because her example inspires me. She volunteers at the food bank on weekends, not for recognition, but because she believes it's the right thing to do. She sends birthday cards to every one of her students, even the ones who drive her crazy, because she wants them to know someone, cares about them. She remembers the names of my co-workers' children and asks about their families because she understands that relationships matter more than transactions. Patricia's carefully constructed composure was beginning to crack. I never said Emma wasn't a good person, David. I just want the best for you. The best for me, David repeated slowly. Or the best for your image of what my life should look like. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the table, I could see family members processing not just this conversation, but years of similar dynamics they'd witnessed or experienced themselves. Caroline was looking at her mother with an expression that suggested she was reevaluating her own relationships and interactions. Lucas, who had been quiet during his father's reading, suddenly spoke up again. Dad, read the part about how Mom is your best friend. David smiled at his son, and I could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. That's a good one, buddy. He flipped through a few more pages and found what Lucas was referring to. This is from our anniversary last year. I wrote, "Today marks 5 years of marriage, and I finally understand what people mean when they say they married their best. Friend, Emma is the person I want to tell everything to. She's the first person I think of when something good happens, and the only person I want to comfort me when something goes wrong. She laughs at my terrible jokes, tolerates my moods, and somehow makes me feel like the best version of myself even on my worst days." The reading was interrupted by the sound of Patricia's chair scraping against the patio stones as she stood up abruptly. "I think we've heard enough private thoughts for one evening," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Have we?" David asked, remaining seated and looking up at his mother. "Because I'm just getting started." Patricia's mask of composure finally slipped completely. "You're embarrassing yourself, David, and you're embarrassing your wife. This isn't how we handle family matters." "How do we handle family matters, Mom?" David asked, his voice calm but carrying a steel edge I'd never heard before. "By letting you make subtle digs at my wife for 6 years while I pretend not to notice? By allowing you to undermine her confidence and make her feel unwelcome in our family? By staying silent while you treat the woman I love like she's somehow not good enough for us?" The confrontation I'd been dreading for years was finally happening, but it wasn't playing out the way I'd always imagined. I'd always pictured myself as the one who would eventually snap, who would finally stand up and defend myself against Patricia's constant criticism. Instead, it was David who was taking the stand, armed with his own written words as evidence of what our marriage really meant to him. Caroline cleared her throat gently. "Mom, maybe you should sit back down. I think we all need to hear this." Patricia looked around the table, perhaps realizing for the first time that she didn't have the support she'd expected. Her other children and family members weren't rushing to her defense or dismissing David's accusations. Instead, they were looking at her with expressions that ranged from concern to disappointment. Slowly, Patricia sank back into her chair, but her posture remained rigid and defensive. "I have always wanted what's best for this family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then listen to what your son has been trying to tell you," Uncle Frank said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since the conversation began, and his words carried the weight of someone who'd been observing family dynamics for decades. "Listen to what he's written about the woman he chose to spend his life with." David looked at his uncle gratefully, then turned back to his journal. "This is from just last week," he said. "After that night when Emma stayed up late grading papers and then got up early to make Lucas his favorite breakfast before his field trip." He began reading again, and his voice grew softer, more intimate. "I watched Emma this morning, moving around our kitchen at 6 a.m., making sure Lucas had everything he needed for his school trip. She was exhausted from staying up late with her students' work, but she was humming while she packed his lunch, adding little notes in his lunchbox like she always does. I realized that this is what love looks like in action. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but thousands of small acts of care and attention that build a life together." Patricia was staring down at her hands, her fingers twisted together in her lap. The fight seemed to have gone out of her, replaced by something that looked like shame or recognition. "Mom," David said gently, "I need you to understand something. Emma isn't holding me back from success. She's the reason I understand what success actually means. Before her, I was chasing achievements that would impress other people. Now I'm building a life that makes me happy. There's a difference." The dinner table, which an hour earlier had been filled with the comfortable chatter of family celebration, now sat in contemplative silence. The untouched dessert plates seemed to mock the festive atmosphere Patricia had worked so hard to create. But something important was happening in that silence, something that felt like the beginning of truth rather than the end of comfort. Lucas, who had inadvertently orchestrated this entire revelation, looked around the table with the satisfaction of a child who'd successfully completed a difficult task. "See?" he said simply. I told you Dad wrote nice things about Mom. Despite everything, that innocent comment drew a few small smiles around the table, but the real work of this conversation was just beginning, and I could sense that Patricia was finally ready to face some uncomfortable truths about the way she'd been treating me all these years. The silence stretched across Patricia's patio, like a held breath, broken only by the distant sound of evening traffic and the gentle hum of her pool filter. I watched as she sat perfectly still in her chair, her usual commanding presence diminished to something smaller and more fragile. The woman who had orchestrated family gatherings with military precision for decades seemed suddenly uncertain of her role in her own home. David continued to hold his journal, his fingers tracing the edges of pages filled with thoughts he'd never intended to share publicly. But Lucas had changed everything with his innocent discovery, and now there was no going back to the careful pretense that had governed our family dynamics for so long. "There's something else I wrote," David said quietly, looking directly at his mother. "Something I wrote after last Christmas, when you suggested that Emma's gift to you wasn't thoughtful enough." I remembered that Christmas with painful clarity. I'd spent weeks researching Patricia's interests, finally settling on a beautiful silk scarf from a boutique she'd mentioned admiring. It wasn't expensive by Henderson family standards, but it represented a significant portion of my teacher's salary. Patricia had opened it with the kind of polite smile reserved for gifts from distant acquaintances, commenting that it was lovely, though not really my style. "I wrote about watching Emma's face that day," David continued, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "About how she tried to hide her disappointment when you dismissed her gift. About how she'd spent her lunch breaks for 3 weeks visiting different stores to find something you'd genuinely like." Caroline shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mom, I remember that. Emma looked so hurt." "I also remember," David said, flipping through his journal, "that Emma spent the entire next day cooking your favorite dishes for our second Christmas dinner, even though you'd made that comment about how store-bought pie would have been fine." Patricia's face flushed slightly. "I was trying to be helpful. She didn't need to go to all that trouble." "But she wanted to," David replied. "She wanted to contribute something meaningful to our family celebration. And instead of appreciating her effort, you found ways to diminish it." The weight of years of similar interactions seemed to settle over the table like a heavy blanket. I could see family members glancing at each other, perhaps remembering their own observations of these dynamics, moments when they'd sensed tension but hadn't understood its source. Michael's wife Jennifer spoke up again, her voice gentle but firm. "Patricia, I think we've all noticed how you talk to Emma differently than you talk to the rest of us." "That's not true," Patricia said quickly, but her protest lacked conviction. "It is true, Mom," Caroline said softly. "I've seen it, too. The way you introduce Emma at social events, like she's somehow less accomplished than the rest of us. The way you talk about her job like it's a hobby rather than a career." Uncle Frank nodded slowly. "Pat, you introduced Emma to the Washingtons last year as David's wife who works with children, not as David's wife who's an elementary school teacher. There's a difference in how those introductions sound." Patricia looked around the table, her expression growing more defensive. "I've always been polite to Emma. I've welcomed her into this family." "Polite isn't the same as accepting," David said, his voice gaining strength. "And welcoming someone isn't the same as making them feel valued." He turned to another page in his journal, one that looked well-worn from repeated reading. "This is from 2 years ago, after that dinner when you talked about how important it was for successful men to have wives who understood the social aspects of career advancement." I remembered that evening, too. Patricia had spent most of the dinner discussing the wives of various prominent businessmen in Phoenix, praising their involvement in charity boards and country club activities. She'd made pointed comments about how these women understood that their role was to enhance their husbands' professional reputations through strategic social connections. "I wrote," David continued, That Emma enhances my life in ways that have nothing to do with social climbing or professional networking. She makes me a better person by seeing good in everyone she meets. She volunteers at the literacy program not because it looks good on a resume, but because she believes every adult deserves the chance to read to their children. Lucas, who had been quietly listening to his father read, suddenly perked up. "Mom, tell them about Mrs. Garcia." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Mrs. Garcia was one of my adult literacy students, a grandmother who had been too embarrassed to admit she couldn't read until her granddaughter started school. I'd been working with her for over a year, meeting at the library every Saturday morning. "Lucas," I said gently, "that's not really important right now." "Yes, it is," David said, looking at me with an expression of pure love. "Tell them about Mrs. Garcia, Emma." I glanced around the table, feeling suddenly exposed. These kinds of personal stories weren't typically shared at Henderson family gatherings, which tended to focus on professional achievements and social accomplishments. "Mrs. Garcia is 63 years old," I began hesitantly. "She never learned to read because she had to work to support her family when she was young. She's been coming to the literacy program for a year because she wants to be able to read bedtime stories to her granddaughter." "And what happened last month?" David prompted gently. "She read her first complete book," I said, unable to keep the pride out of my voice. "A picture book about a little girl who plants a garden. She cried when she finished it, and then she called her granddaughter on the phone and read the whole thing again." The table was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of confrontation, but the thoughtful pause of people processing something meaningful. "That's what success looks like to Emma," David said, his voice filled with admiration. "Not social status or professional recognition, but the moment when someone discovers they're capable of something they never thought possible." Patricia was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. For the first time in 6 years, she seemed to be really seeing me rather than looking through me or around me. "I didn't know about any of that," she said quietly. "Because you never asked," David replied, but his tone wasn't accusatory. It was sad. "You never asked Emma about her work beyond the surface level. You never asked about what mattered to her or what she was passionate about." Caroline leaned forward slightly. "Emma, why didn't you ever talk about this stuff at family dinners?" I considered her question carefully. "Because I learned early on that my contributions to conversations weren't really valued. When I did try to share stories about my students or my volunteer work, they were usually dismissed or changed into discussions about more important topics." "More important according to whom?" Uncle Frank asked, and there was an edge to his voice that suggested he was beginning to understand the full scope of what had been happening. Patricia finally found her voice again. "I never meant to dismiss anyone's contributions. I just thought we should focus on achievements that would help build the family's reputation." "Whose reputation?" Michael asked. "Because Emma's work reflects well on all of us. Having a teacher in the family, someone who's making a real difference in children's lives, that's something to be proud of." David turned to another section of his journal, his expression growing more tender. "This is what I wrote after Emma's school recognition ceremony last spring." Patricia looked confused. "What recognition ceremony?" "The one where Emma was named Teacher of the Year for her district," David said, and I could hear both pride and sadness in his voice. "The one none of you knew about because Emma didn't think anyone would be interested in attending." The admission hung in the air like an indictment. I had indeed won the district's Teacher of the Year award, a recognition that came with a ceremony attended by school board members, parents, and families of the honored teachers. David had been there, beaming with pride as I received the award, but I hadn't even mentioned it to his family. "Why didn't you tell us?" Caroline asked, and she sounded genuinely hurt. "Because I assumed it wasn't the kind of achievement this Family would consider significant, I said honestly. It's not a promotion or a salary increase. It's just recognition for doing my job well. Just recognition? David said, shaking his head. Emma, you were chosen out of over 200 teachers in the district. Parents wrote letters about how you changed their children's lives. Your principal said you were the most dedicated educator he'd worked with in 20 years. He began reading from his journal again. I sat in that auditorium watching my wife receive an award for excellence in her chosen profession, and I felt so proud I thought my chest might burst. But I also felt sad, because I knew she wouldn't share this moment with my family. She's learned to keep her victories small and private because she's been taught that they don't matter to us. Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began flowing down her cheeks, and her hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. I had no idea, she whispered. I honestly had no idea. The saddest part, David continued, is that Emma has more natural warmth and genuine kindness than anyone I know. But she's learned to hide those qualities at family gatherings because they've been treated as weaknesses rather than strengths. Lucas, who had been watching the adults with growing concern, suddenly stood up and walked around the table to where I was sitting. Without saying a word, he climbed into my lap and wrapped his arms around my neck. "Don't be sad, Mom," he whispered in my ear. "I think you're the best teacher and the best mom in the whole world." The simple honesty of his declaration broke something open in my chest. I hugged him tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and feeling the solid warmth of his small body against mine. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," I whispered back. "These are happy tears." David was watching us with an expression of such profound love that it took my breath away. "This is what I wrote about that moment," he said, turning to a recent page in his journal. "I wrote about watching Emma with our son, seeing how naturally she nurtures him, how she builds his confidence without ever making him feel like his worth depends on impressing other people." He began reading again, his voice soft but clear. "Lucas came home from school yesterday upset because he'd gotten a C on his math test. Instead of lecturing him about studying harder or comparing him to other kids who did better, Emma sat with him and helped him understand the problems he'd missed. When he finally got them right, she celebrated like he'd won the Nobel Prize. That's the kind of mother she is, and that's the kind of wife she is too. She doesn't love conditionally based on performance or achievement. She loves completely for who we are right now in this moment." The patio had grown quieter as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Patricia's perfectly manicured garden. The string lights she'd hung for the occasion began to twinkle automatically, creating an almost magical atmosphere that seemed at odds with the emotional intensity of our conversation. Patricia was still crying quietly, her usual perfect composure completely abandoned. "Emma," she said finally, her voice barely audible, "I owe you an apology, a huge apology." I looked at her across the table, this woman who had been the source of so much anxiety and self-doubt in my life. For the first time, I saw past her polished exterior to someone who looked genuinely remorseful and confused about her own behavior. "I thought I was protecting David," she continued, her words coming slowly as if she were discovering them as she spoke. "I thought I was making sure he didn't settle for less than he deserved. But I was wrong about what he deserved, wasn't I?" David reached across the table and took his mother's hand. "Mom, you weren't wrong to want good things for me. You were wrong about what good things look like. I was raised to believe that success meant status and social position," Patricia said, her voice growing stronger. "My mother judged everyone by their bank account and their address. I swore I wouldn't be like that, but I guess I just found more subtle ways to do the same thing." Uncle Frank, who had been quietly observing this entire exchange, cleared his throat. "Pat, your mother was a product of her time, when women's worth was measured by their husbands' achievements. But times have changed. Emma's worth isn't determined by David's success or failure. She has her own value, her own accomplishments, her own contributions to make. I see that now, Patricia said, looking directly at me for what felt like the first time in years. I see that I've been blind to who you really are because I was so focused on who I thought David should be with. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the patio door sliding open. Bob Henderson, David's father, stepped outside carrying a tray of coffee cups. He'd been inside during most of our discussion, cleaning up the kitchen and staying, out of what he'd probably recognized as a necessary family confrontation. "Thought you folks might want some coffee," he said, setting the tray on the table. His eyes took in the scene, the tear-stained faces and emotional intensity, and his expression grew concerned. "Everything okay out here?" "Actually, Dad," David said, "everything is better than it's been in years. We're finally talking about things that should have been discussed a long time ago." Bob poured coffee into several cups, his movements careful and deliberate. He'd always been the quieter parent, content to let Patricia take the lead in family matters. But I could see in his expression that he understood the significance of what was happening. "Emma," Patricia said suddenly, her voice urgent, "I need you to know that I never disliked you personally. I was just so afraid that David was making choices based on emotion rather than logic. I thought successful marriages required more strategic thinking." "What kind of strategic thinking?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Marrying someone who would enhance his career prospects, who came from the right kind of background, who understood how to navigate social situations that could benefit him professionally." Patricia shook her head. "It sounds terrible when I say it out loud. It sounds like you were trying to arrange a business partnership rather than supporting a marriage," Caroline observed. "Maybe I was," Patricia admitted. "Maybe I never really understood what love looked like in practice rather than theory." David opened his journal to what appeared to be one of the final entries. "This is something I wrote just last week, after we put Lucas to bed and Emma fell asleep on the couch while grading papers." He began reading in a voice so tender it made my throat tight with emotion. "I covered Emma with a blanket and turned off the lamp, but I stayed in the living room for a while just watching her sleep. Her red pen was still in her hand, and there were student papers scattered around her like confetti. She'd probably been working for 3 hours after Lucas went to bed, writing encouraging comments on assignments and planning tomorrow's lessons. This is what devotion looks like. Not grand romantic gestures, but daily acts of service to the people and causes she cares about. I am so lucky to be loved by someone who gives so completely of herself." Lucas had fallen asleep in my lap during his father's reading, his head heavy against my shoulder. I stroked his hair gently, marveling at how this brave little boy had set in motion a conversation that was reshaping our entire family dynamic. "I want to make this right," Patricia said suddenly, her voice filled with determination. "I want to find a way to repair the damage I've done." "It's not about making grand gestures, Mom," David said gently. "It's about changing how you see Emma and how you treat her going forward." Patricia nodded slowly, then turned to look at me directly. "Emma, would you be willing to have coffee with me sometime this week? Just the two of us? I'd like to hear about your work, your students, the things that matter to you. I'd like to get to know the woman my son fell in love with." The invitation surprised me. In 6 years of family gatherings, Patricia had never suggested spending time together outside of required family events. The idea of having a one-on-one conversation with her felt both terrifying and potentially healing. "I'd like that," I said, and I was surprised to realize I meant it. The evening air had grown cooler, and Bob began lighting the small torches Patricia had placed around the patio for ambiance. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across our faces, creating an intimate atmosphere that seemed perfect for the kind of honest conversation we'd been having. "There's one more thing," David said, turning to the very last page of his journal. This is what I wrote yesterday, when I was thinking about tonight's dinner and wondering how to help my family understand what Emma means to me. He looked around the table, making eye contact with each family member before beginning to read. Tomorrow is my mother's family achievement dinner, and I've been thinking about what achievements really mean. Emma achieves something extraordinary every single day, though her accomplishments don't come with titles or salary increases. She achieves the trust of children who have learned not to trust adults. She achieves moments of breakthrough with students who have been told they're not smart enough. She achieves the kind of love that makes a house feel like home and a family feel like a safe place to be yourself. He paused, his voice thickening with emotion. If we're going to celebrate achievements tonight, then I want to celebrate the woman who taught me that the most important successes are the ones that happen in the quiet moments when nobody's watching. Emma Rodriguez Henderson is my greatest achievement, not because I won her, but because she chose me. The silence that followed was profound and peaceful, filled with the kind of understanding that comes after difficult truths have been spoken and accepted. Around the table, I could see family members processing not just what they'd learned about David's feelings for me, but what they'd discovered about their own assumptions and behaviors. Lucas stirred in my lap, opening sleepy eyes to look around at the adults who were all sitting quietly in the flickering torchlight. "Did everyone hear the nice things Dad wrote about Mom?" he asked drowsily. "We heard them, buddy," David said, reaching over to stroke his son's hair. "And I think everyone understands now why I wanted them to know." Patricia stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and uncertain. She walked around the table until she was standing beside my chair, looking down at me with an expression that held years of regret and the beginning of genuine respect. "Emma," she said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the ways I made you feel unwelcome in this family. I'm sorry for dismissing your achievements and minimizing your contributions. I'm sorry for treating you like you weren't good enough for my son, when the truth is that he's lucky to have found someone who loves him the way you do." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "Most of all, I'm sorry that it took my grandson's bravery to open my eyes to what I should have seen all along." I shifted Lucas gently in my lap and stood up to face my mother-in-law. For the first time in 6 years, when she opened her arms to embrace me, it felt like an invitation rather than an obligation. "Thank you," I whispered as we hugged. "That means more to me than you know." As we separated, I could see tears in her eyes again, but these were different tears than the ones she'd shed earlier. These looked like tears of relief, the kind that come when a burden you've been carrying for too long is finally set down. The family achievement dinner had indeed become a celebration of achievements, though not the kind Patricia had originally planned. We had achieved honesty, understanding, and the beginning of genuine connection. Most importantly, we had achieved the kind of family moment that David would undoubtedly write about in his journal. One where love was finally recognized and celebrated in all its quiet, daily forms. The weeks following that transformative dinner unfolded like the slow blooming of a flower that had been waiting years for the right conditions to grow. Patricia called me 3 days later, her voice tentative but sincere, asking if I'd like to meet for coffee at a small cafe near my school. The invitation felt surreal after years of polite distance, but I found myself genuinely curious about what this new chapter of our relationship might look like. When I arrived at the cafe, Patricia was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 steaming mugs in front of her. She'd chosen a place that was clearly outside her usual social circle, a cozy spot frequented by teachers and local artists, rather than the upscale establishments where she typically conducted her social meetings. The gesture felt intentional, like she was trying to meet me on my territory, rather than expecting me to adapt to hers. "I ordered you a vanilla latte," she said as I approached the table. "I remembered David mentioning that was your favorite, though I realize I should probably ask what you prefer rather than assuming." It was such a small thing, but the acknowledgement that she'd been making assumptions about me for years felt significant. I sat down across from her, wrapping my hands around the warm mug and inhaling the familiar comfort of coffee and vanilla. "Thank you," I said. "This is perfect." For a few moments, we sat in comfortable silence, both of us perhaps unsure how to begin a conversation that wasn't filtered through family gathering politeness or underlying tension. Patricia looked different in this setting, less armored somehow, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual carefully coordinated outfits. "I've been thinking a lot about what David read from his journal," she finally said. "About the things you've accomplished that I never bothered to learn about. I realized I don't even know basic things about your life, like how you became interested in teaching, or what made you choose to work in the district you're in." It was such a fundamental question, the kind of thing that people typically ask when they're getting to know someone new. The fact that we were having this conversation after 6 years of family membership felt both sad and hopeful. "I grew up in a house where education was everything," I began, surprising myself with how easily the words came. My parents immigrated from Mexico when I was 3, and they worked multiple jobs to make sure my sister and I could focus on school. My father cleaned office buildings at night, and my mother worked in a hotel laundry during the day. They were exhausted most of the time, but they never missed a parent-teacher conference or school play. Patricia leaned forward slightly, her attention completely focused on my words. That must have been difficult for them. It was, but they never made it feel like a burden. They made it feel like an investment in our future. When I graduated from college, my dad cried at the ceremony. He said it was the proudest moment of his life, seeing his daughter become a teacher. I paused, remembering that day and how it had shaped my understanding of what success really meant. He passed away 2 years before I met David, but I know he would have loved seeing me work with kids who remind me of myself at that age. Children whose parents are working multiple jobs and sacrificing everything for their children's education. Patricia's eyes had grown misty as I spoke. "I never knew about your father. David never mentioned that he'd passed away." "I don't talk about it much," I admitted. "Grief isn't really something that comes up naturally in casual conversation. But losing him so young made me realize how important it is to recognize people's worth while they're still here to hear it." The comment hung between us, not accusatory but honest. Patricia absorbed it quietly, perhaps understanding that my observation applied to more than just my father's memory. "Tell me about your students," she said after a moment. "I want to understand what makes your work so meaningful to you." For the next hour, I found myself sharing stories I'd never thought Patricia would be interested in hearing. I told her about Maria, a quiet girl whose confidence had blossomed when she discovered her talent for creative writing. I described the reading garden we'd created in our classroom, where students could curl up with books during quiet time. I explained the Pen Pal program I'd started with a retirement home, pairing my 8-year-olds with elderly residents who lit up when they received handwritten letters decorated with crayon drawings. Patricia listened with genuine attention, asking follow-up questions and showing the kind of engagement I'd never experienced from her before. When I mentioned the after-school tutoring program I ran for struggling readers, she asked about the challenges of working with kids who'd been labeled as learning disabled. "The hardest part," I said, "is helping them believe they're capable of more than they think they are. So many of these children have been told they're not smart enough or not trying hard enough, but often they just learn differently, or they need someone to take the time to find the teaching method that works for their particular brain." "Like Mrs. Garcia from the literacy program?" Patricia asked, and I was surprised she remembered the story David had prompted me to share at dinner. "Exactly like Mrs. Garcia. She's brilliant in ways that have nothing to do with reading. She can solve complex problems, manage a household, raise successful children. She just needed someone to teach her the connection between letters and sounds in a way that made sense to her." Patricia was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I think I owe you an apology for more than just the way I treated you," she said finally. I think I owe you an apology for not recognizing that what you do is just as important as anything David or Caroline or Michael do in their careers. The acknowledgement felt like a gift I hadn't known I was waiting for. Thank you, I said. Simply. That means a lot. I was thinking, Patricia continued, about what you said regarding the after-school tutoring program. Does your school have adequate funding for supplies and materials? I laughed, but not unkindly. No school ever has adequate funding for supplies and materials. We're always writing grants and organizing fundraisers to pay for basic classroom needs. What if I helped with that? Patricia asked, and there was something tentative but earnest in her voice. I've been involved in various charity boards over the years, mostly focused on causes that looked good socially rather than causes I was personally passionate about. But maybe I could use those connections to benefit something that actually matters. The offer surprised me, both because it was unexpected and because it suggested Patricia was thinking about ways to actively support my work rather than simply tolerating it. That would be incredible, I said. There are so many programs that could benefit from additional funding. Good, Patricia said with something that looked like relief. I'd like to be involved in something meaningful for a change. Our conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing with a text message. It was from David, letting me know that Lucas had gotten off the school bus safely and was starting his homework. The simple domestic communication felt precious in that moment, a reminder of the life David and I had built together despite the family tensions that had surrounded us. He's a good father, Patricia said, noticing my smile as I read the message. He's an amazing father, I agreed. Lucas adores him. Lucas is a remarkable child, Patricia said. What he did at dinner, speaking up for you the way he did, that took incredible courage. I thought about my son's decision to share his father's journal, the way he'd instinctively understood that truth was more important than keeping adult secrets. He's always been sensitive to fairness, I said. Even as a toddler, he couldn't stand to see anyone being treated unfairly. He gets that from you, Patricia said quietly. The sensitivity, the sense of justice, those are qualities I should have recognized and valued instead of seeing them as weaknesses. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from Lucas's school activities to my volunteer work to Patricia's own childhood and the pressures she'd faced from her own mother. By the time we parted ways, something fundamental had shifted between us. We weren't suddenly best friends, but we'd laid the groundwork for a genuine relationship based on mutual respect rather than polite obligation. Over the following weeks, Patricia began showing up in unexpected ways. She attended Lucas's school science fair, genuinely interested in his project about plant growth and asking thoughtful questions about his research process. She volunteered to help with the school's annual book fair, spending an entire Saturday organizing inventory and helping children select books within their budget constraints. Most surprisingly, she started a monthly dinner tradition where she invited just our small family, creating space for quieter, more intimate conversations than the large gatherings that had been the norm. These dinners felt different from the formal events of the past, with Patricia asking Lucas about his friends and school activities, inquiring about my current students and their progress, and sharing stories from her own life that revealed depths I'd never suspected. David noticed the changes immediately, of course. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, he pulled me into his arms and held me close, his face buried in my hair. "How are you feeling about everything?" he asked. "This change with my mother, I mean. It's been pretty dramatic." I considered his question carefully. The transformation in Patricia's behavior toward me had been remarkable, but it had also required me to adjust my own expectations and emotional defenses. For years, I'd armored myself against her criticism, and learning to trust her newfound acceptance felt vulnerable and uncertain. "It's good," I said finally. "Really good, but also a little overwhelming. I spent so long expecting rejection that I'm not sure how to handle genuine acceptance. David pulled back to look at my face, his expression tender and understanding. "You don't have to trust it completely right away," he said. "But I think what happened at that dinner changed something fundamental for her. She finally saw you the way I've always seen you." "What do you think changed her mind?" I asked. Honestly, I think it was hearing my own words reflected back to her. She couldn't dismiss my feelings about you as temporary infatuation or poor judgment when she heard them in my own handwriting, accumulated over years of marriage. But more than that, I think Lucas helped her understand that her behavior was affecting our whole family, not just you. David was right about Lucas's role in the transformation. Our son had continued to be a bridge between the adults, naturally, including Patricia in conversations about school and friends, sharing his artwork and stories with her in the same open way he did with everyone else he loved. His easy acceptance of her newfound warmth had perhaps made it easier for her to sustain the changes she was trying to make. The most significant change came about 2 months after that pivotal dinner. Patricia called to tell me about a conversation she'd had with the principal at my school, whom she'd contacted about potential funding opportunities. During their discussion, she'd learned about the district's need for reading specialists and had offered to sponsor a training program for teachers interested in specializing in literacy education. "I know you mentioned wanting to pursue additional training in reading intervention," she said when she called to tell me about the program. "I thought maybe this could be an opportunity for you to advance your career while also helping other teachers develop skills they need." The offer was generous beyond anything I could have imagined from Patricia. But more than the financial support, it represented her genuine understanding of my professional goals and her respect for my expertise in my field. "Patricia, I don't know what to say," I told her. "This is an incredible opportunity." "You don't need to say anything except yes," she replied. "I should have been supporting your career development from the beginning. This is just me trying to make up for lost time." The reading specialist program began that fall, and I found myself part of a cohort of teachers from across the district who were passionate about helping struggling readers. The coursework was challenging and rewarding, diving deep into the science of reading instruction and evidence-based intervention strategies. Patricia attended my graduation ceremony 8 months later, sitting in the front row next to David and Lucas, applauding as enthusiastically as if I were receiving a doctoral degree. But perhaps the most meaningful moment of our evolving relationship came during a quiet Sunday afternoon in spring, almost a year after Lucas had shared his father's journal with our family. Patricia had come over for dinner, as had become her custom, and afterward we were all sitting in our backyard while Lucas played with our neighbor's dog. "Emma," Patricia said suddenly, "I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." I looked up from the magazine I'd been flipping through, noting the serious tone in her voice. "I was wrong," she continued. "Not just about you, specifically, but about what I thought my son needed in a partner. I thought success meant marrying someone who would enhance his social status or professional reputation. But watching you two together this past year, seeing how happy he is, understanding the kind of home you've created for Lucas, I realized that what he actually needed was someone who would love him unconditionally and help him become the best version of himself." She paused, looking across the yard where David was teaching Lucas how to throw a baseball. "You've done that for him. You've made him more confident, more compassionate, more grounded. He's become a better man because of your influence, not in spite of it." The acknowledgement felt like the completion of a circle that had begun with Lucas's brave decision to share his father's private thoughts. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "It means everything to me." "There's something else," Patricia said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small wrapped box. "This belonged to my mother-in-law, David's grandmother. It was supposed to go to whoever David married, but I held on to it because I didn't think." She trailed off, then started again. "Because I was too stubborn and proud to admit that David had chosen well." I opened the box to find a delicate gold bracelet set with small sapphires, clearly an antique piece with significant sentimental value. Patricia, this is beautiful, but I can't accept something this precious. Yes, you can, she said firmly, because you're not just David's wife anymore. You're my daughter-in-law in the truest sense of the word, and I want you to have something that represents your place in this family. As she helped me fasten the bracelet around my wrist, I felt the weight of acceptance that I'd been seeking for so many years. Not the conditional approval I'd tried to earn through perfect behavior and constant accommodation, but the genuine welcome that comes from being seen and valued for who you actually are. That evening, after Patricia had gone home and Lucas was asleep, David and I sat on our back porch talking about the remarkable transformation our family had undergone. The journal that had started everything was sitting on the table between us, and David picked it up, flipping through pages filled with his private thoughts about our life together. I never intended for anyone else to read this, he said, but I'm glad Lucas found it. I'm glad we finally had that conversation. What are you going to write about tonight? I asked, curious about how he would document this latest chapter in our family story. David smiled, already reaching for his pen. I'm going to write about how sometimes the most important truths need a child's voice to be heard. I'm going to write about watching my mother discover who you really are and seeing her fall in love with our family the way I did years ago. I'm going to write about how proud I am to be married to a woman who handles grace and forgiveness with the same skill she uses to teach children how to read. He paused, looking at me with the same expression of wonder he'd worn on our wedding day. Most of all, I'm going to write about how lucky I am that Lucas inherited your sense of justice and your courage to speak truth when it needs to be heard. As David began writing, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The years of feeling invisible and inadequate seemed like distant memories now, replaced by the solid certainty of being known and cherished by the people who mattered most. Lucas's innocent discovery of his father's journal had created ripple effects none of us could have anticipated, transforming not just my relationship with Patricia, but our entire family's understanding of what love and acceptance actually looked like in practice. The little boy who had climbed onto a chair and announced that his grandfather had written nice things about his mother had given us all a gift more precious than he could possibly understand. He had given us the truth, wrapped in childish honesty, and delivered with the fearless love that only children possess. And that truth had set us all free to become the family we were always meant to be. 2 years had passed since that transformative evening at Patricia's dinner table, and I was standing in the hallway of Mountain View Elementary, watching my third-grade students file into their classroom after lunch recess. Their faces were flushed from playing outside, and their chatter filled the corridor with the kind of joyful noise that made me remember why I'd chosen this profession in the first place. Among them was a new student, Sophia Ramirez, who had joined our class just 3 weeks earlier after her family moved from El Paso. Sophia reminded me of myself at that age, quiet and observant, carrying the weight of being different in a place where fitting in seemed to matter more than anything else. Her English was still developing, and I could see the frustration in her eyes when she couldn't find the words to express her thoughts. But I also saw something else, a spark of intelligence and creativity that just needed the right encouragement to flourish. Mrs. Henderson, Sophia said as she approached my desk, holding a folded piece of paper. I wrote something for you. I opened the paper to find a short story written in a mixture of English and Spanish, illustrated with careful drawings of a little girl planting seeds in a garden. The story was about how the seeds looked dead at first, but with patience and care, they grew into beautiful flowers that made everyone in the neighborhood smile. Sophia, this is wonderful, I said, kneeling down to her level. Your story reminds me that sometimes the most beautiful things take time to grow, but they're worth waiting for. She beamed at me, and in that moment, I thought about my own journey of growth, how long it had taken for me to fully bloom in the Henderson family, and how patient love had made all the difference. That afternoon, as I was organizing papers at my desk after the students had been dismissed, I heard a familiar voice from the doorway. "Excuse me, Mrs. Henderson. I hope I'm not interrupting." I looked up to see Patricia standing in the entrance to my classroom, wearing jeans and a simple blouse, her arms full of books and school supplies. Over the past 2 years, she had become a regular volunteer at our school, but seeing her in my classroom still felt surreal sometimes. "Patricia, what a lovely surprise," I said, standing up to greet her. "What brings you by today?" "I was meeting with Principal Martinez about the Reading Garden project, and I wanted to drop off these materials for your classroom library." She set down several boxes filled with brand new chapter books, art supplies, and educational games. "I also wanted to ask if you'd heard anything about the State Teaching Award nominations yet." My heart skipped a beat. Principal Martinez had nominated me for Arizona's Teacher of the Year award 3 months earlier, but I'd tried not to get my hopes up. The competition was fierce, with hundreds of exceptional educators across the state vying for recognition. "I haven't heard anything yet," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "And honestly, I'm trying not to think about it too much. There are so many deserving teachers out there." Patricia smiled at me with the kind of maternal pride I'd once thought was reserved only for Caroline and Michael. "Emma, you're going to win that award. I've seen the impact you have on these children, the way you transform their relationship with learning. The selection committee would be foolish not to recognize your work." Her confidence in me still took my breath away sometimes. The woman who had once questioned whether I was good enough for her son now championed my achievements with the fierce loyalty of a devoted ally. "Even if I don't win," I said, "being nominated feels like a victory in itself. When I started teaching, I never imagined I'd be considered for something like this." "That's exactly why you deserve it," Patricia replied. "You didn't go into teaching for the recognition. You did it because you genuinely care about making a difference in children's lives." We were interrupted by Lucas bursting through the classroom door, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his face lit up with excitement. At 10 years old, he had grown taller and more confident, but he still possessed the same sense of justice and honesty that had changed our family's trajectory 2 years earlier. "Mom! Grandma Pat!" he called out, running over to give us both hugs. "Guess what happened at school today?" "What happened, sweetheart?" I asked, smoothing down his unruly hair. "Remember Tommy Chen, the kid in my class who was having trouble with reading? Well, today he read an entire chapter book out loud to the class, and everyone clapped for him. He said it was because his reading tutor used the same methods you taught his mom about." I felt a warm glow of satisfaction. Tommy's mother had attended one of the parent workshops I conducted on supporting struggling readers at home. Seeing the techniques work for her son was exactly the kind of ripple effect that made all the extra hours worthwhile. "That's wonderful, Lucas," Patricia said, her voice filled with genuine enthusiasm. "Your mom's teaching methods are helping children all over the district." "I know," Lucas said matter-of-factly. "Dad says Mom is like a superhero, but instead of fighting bad guys, she fights illiteracy." The simple statement made both Patricia and me laugh, but there was truth in Lucas's childish observation. The reading specialist certification Patricia had sponsored had allowed me to work with struggling students throughout the district, and the impact was measurable in improved test scores, and more importantly, in children's restored confidence in their ability to learn. "Speaking of your father," Patricia said, "he should be here soon to pick you up. We're all having dinner at my house tonight, remember?" These family dinners had become a cherished weekly tradition, replacing the formal gatherings of the past with relaxed evenings where genuine conversation flowed as freely as the wine. David often brought his journal to these dinners now, reading passages aloud that captured funny moments with Lucas or reflections on our daily life together. "Can we stop by the bookstore on the way?" Lucas asked. "I want to get a new journal. like dads. Mrs. Peterson says writing down our thoughts helps us understand our feelings better. I exchanged a glance with Patricia, both of us recognizing the irony of Lucas wanting to start his own journal. The boy who had inadvertently changed our family by reading his father's private thoughts now wanted to begin documenting his own. Of course we can stop by the bookstore, Patricia said. I think starting a journal is a wonderful idea. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave the classroom, my phone rang with a call from an unknown Phoenix number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something prompted me to answer. Hello, this is Emma Henderson. Mrs. Henderson, this is Rebecca Sullivan from the Arizona Department of Education. I'm calling with some exciting news about the Teacher of the Year nominations. My heart started pounding, and I caught Patricia's eye. She immediately moved. Closer, her expression alert and expectant. I'm pleased to inform you that you've been selected as one of the 5 finalists for Arizona Teacher of the Year. Congratulations on this outstanding achievement. I felt my knees go weak, and I had to sit down on the edge of my desk. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? You're a finalist for Arizona Teacher of the Year, Mrs. Henderson. The final selection will be announced at the award ceremony next month, but being chosen as a finalist is a significant honor in itself. You should be very proud. After I ended the call, I sat in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process what I'd just heard. Patricia was watching me with barely contained excitement, and Lucas was bouncing on his toes with curiosity. Well? Patricia prompted. What was that about? I'm a finalist, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For Arizona Teacher of the Year, one of 5 finalists. Patricia let out a sound that was part gasp, part cheer, and immediately pulled me into a fierce hug. Emma, this is incredible! I'm so proud of you. Lucas joined our embrace, not entirely sure what we were celebrating, but caught up in the excitement. Does this mean you're famous now, Mom? I laughed, tears of joy streaming down my face. Not famous, sweetheart. Just recognized for doing work that I love. We have to call David immediately, Patricia said, already reaching for her phone. He needs to know about this right away. As Patricia called David with the news, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I had been a teacher who felt invisible and undervalued, even within my own family. Now I was being recognized at the state level for the work I'd been doing all along, the same work that Patricia had once dismissed as unambitious. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. Patricia's support and David's unwavering belief in my worth had given me the confidence to pursue leadership roles I might never have considered before. The reading specialist certification had led to presenting at educational conferences, mentoring new teachers, and developing curriculum that was now being used in schools across the district. David arrived at the school within minutes, having left his office the moment Patricia called him. He burst through the classroom door with the same excitement Lucas had shown earlier, immediately sweeping me into his arms and spinning me around. Arizona Teacher of the Year finalist, he said, setting me down but keeping his arms around me. Do you know how amazing this is? Do you know how proud I am of you? It's just a nomination, I said, but I couldn't keep the smile off my face. It's not just anything, David replied firmly. This is recognition of what I've known all along, what our family knows, what your students and their parents know. You're an exceptional educator who changes lives every single day. Patricia wiped tears from her eyes as she watched David's enthusiastic reaction. I called Caroline and Michael too, she said. They're both thrilled. Caroline wants to know if she can write a press release for your school district. The idea of Caroline, the successful PR executive, wanting to promote my achievement felt wonderfully surreal. 2 years ago, I'd been the family member whose accomplishments were downplayed or ignored. Now I was being celebrated and supported by the same people who had once made me feel inadequate. There's something else, David said, reaching into his jacket pocket. "I brought this because I thought you might want to read what I wrote about today." He handed me his journal, opened to a page dated that morning. I read his neat handwriting, noting how his documentation of our life had evolved from private observations to shared celebrations. "Today, Emma will find out whether she's been selected as a finalist for Arizona Teacher of the Year," he had written. "Regardless of the outcome, I want to record how proud I am of the woman she's become, not just as an educator, but as a person who has found her voice and learned to claim her worth." Watching her transformation over the past 2 years has been like watching a flower finally receive enough sunlight to reach its full bloom. The entry continued. "She no longer shrinks from recognition or downplays her achievements. She accepts, prays gracefully, and stands confidently in her expertise. The woman who once felt invisible in our family gatherings now leads workshops for other teachers and speaks at educational conferences with authority and passion. Lucas is growing up watching his mother model what it looks like to pursue excellence while staying true to your values." I looked up from the journal to find everyone watching me with expressions of love and pride. "Thank you," I said simply. "All of you. For seeing me, for believing in me, for helping me believe in myself." "We're not done celebrating yet," Patricia announced. "I'm making reservations at that new restaurant downtown. This calls for champagne and a proper celebration." As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the school, I caught sight of Sophia's story still sitting on my desk. The tale of seeds that looked dead, but grew into beautiful flowers with patience and care. I thought about my own metamorphosis, how love and support had transformed not just my relationship with David's family, but my entire sense of self-worth. The drive to the restaurant gave me time to reflect on how dramatically our family dynamics had shifted. Lucas chattered excitedly about telling his friends that his mom was famous, while Patricia called various family members to share the news. David held my hand across the center console, periodically squeezing it and grinning at me like I'd just won the lottery. At dinner, Patricia raised her champagne glass and offered a toast that brought tears to my eyes. "To Emma, who taught us all the difference between conditional acceptance and unconditional love. To a daughter-in-law who became a true daughter, a teacher who became a leader, and a woman who never stopped growing even when the soil seemed too rocky for blooming." David added his own toast, his voice thick with emotion. "To my wife, who shows me every day what it means to live with purpose and integrity. To the mother of my son, who is raising him to value kindness over achievement and character over recognition. To the woman who proved that the most important accomplishments are often the ones that happen quietly, in classrooms and hearts, where love is the curriculum and growth is the graduation." Lucas, not to be outdone, raised his glass of sparkling cider and declared, "To Mom, who is the best teacher in the whole world and the best mom too, and to Grandma Pat, who learned how to see Mom the right way." Patricia's eyes filled with tears at Lucas's innocent acknowledgement of her transformation. "To Lucas," she replied, "who taught us all that sometimes the most important truths need to be spoken by the youngest voices." As we clinked glasses and settled into our celebration dinner, I marveled at the completeness of this moment. The same people who had once made me feel like an outsider were now my biggest champions, genuinely excited about my achievements and proud to claim me as family. The conversation flowed naturally between topics, from Lucas's upcoming science fair project to David's latest client success to Patricia's plans for expanding the school funding program she'd initiated. But underlying every discussion was a sense of contentment and connection that had been missing from our family gatherings for so many years. Later that evening, as David and I were getting ready for bed, he pulled out his journal one more time to record the day's events. I watched him write, occasionally smiling at memories of how this same practice had once felt threatening to our family's carefully maintained facade. "What are you writing about tonight?" I asked, settling into bed beside him. "I'm writing about circles," he said, continuing to write as he spoke. About how Lucas's brave decision to share my private thoughts 2 years ago created ripples that are still changing our lives. About how your recognition as a Teacher of the Year finalist isn't just an individual achievement, but a celebration of the values our entire family has learned to embrace. He paused in his writing and looked at me. I'm also writing about how grateful I am that you never gave up on us, even when it would have been easier to retreat into yourself and accept being undervalued. I had help, I said, thinking about all the moments of support and encouragement that had sustained me through the difficult years. I had you believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. And now you have everyone believing in you, David replied. Patricia, Caroline, Michael, Lucas, your students, your colleagues. You've built a community of people who see your worth because you finally learned to see it yourself. The next few weeks passed in a blur of congratulations and media attention. The local newspaper ran a feature story about my nomination, highlighting the innovative programs I'd developed and the impact I'd had on student achievement. Patricia arranged for several of her social connections to attend a school board meeting where I presented my reading intervention research, and their subsequent donations funded new library materials for 3 elementary schools. Most meaningfully, my former students and their parents organized a surprise celebration at the school, creating a display of letters and artwork expressing how my teaching had influenced their lives. Maria, the quiet girl whose confidence had blossomed through creative writing, was now in middle school and had won a district-wide poetry contest. She read one of her poems at the celebration, dedicating it to Mrs. Henderson, who taught me that my voice mattered. The State Teacher of the Year ceremony was held on a beautiful Saturday evening in May, exactly 2 years and 1 month after Lucas had first shared his father's journal at Patricia's dinner table. My entire family attended, along with colleagues from school and parents of current and former students. When the presenter announced that I had been selected as Arizona's Teacher of the Year, the eruption of applause from my section was so enthusiastic that it drew laughter from the rest of the audience. David was on his feet immediately, his face shining with pride. Patricia was crying openly, applauding with the kind of fierce joy that spoke to years of regret transformed into celebration. Lucas was jumping up and down, cheering loud enough to be heard over the applause. As I walked to the stage to accept the award, I thought about all the moments that had led to this recognition. The late nights spent grading papers and planning lessons, the Saturday mornings volunteering at the literacy center, the professional development courses I'd taken to improve my craft, and yes, the years of feeling undervalued that had motivated me to prove my worth to myself if no one else. In my acceptance speech, I talked about the importance of seeing potential in every student, especially those who don't fit traditional definitions of success. I mentioned Sophia and her bilingual story, Tommy Chen and his breakthrough with reading, and Mrs. Garcia and her determination to read to her granddaughter. But I also talked about the importance of being seen and valued for who we are, not just what we achieve. Every person deserves to be recognized for their contributions, I said, looking out at the audience. Sometimes that recognition comes in the form of official awards like this one. But more often, it comes in the quiet moments when someone sees our worth and reflects it back to us. That kind of recognition has the power to transform not just individuals, but entire families and communities. After the ceremony, as we gathered for photos and congratulations, Lucas tugged on my dress to get my attention. "Mom," he said, "I'm really proud of you, but I was proud of you before you won this award too." "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to hug him. "That means more to me than you know." "Are you going to write about tonight in a journal like Dad does?" he asked. I considered his question, thinking about how David's practice of documenting our life had become such an important part of our family's story. "Maybe I will," I said. "What do you think I should write about?" "Write about how sometimes good things happen to good people, Lucas said with the simple wisdom that had characterized his approach to life since he was small. And how families can get better at loving each other if they practice enough. As we drove home that night, the Teacher of the Year trophy securely buckled into the passenger seat and my family chattering excitedly about the evening's events, I reflected on Lucas's advice. He was right that good things happen to good people. But more than that, good things happened when people were willing to grow, to change, to acknowledge their mistakes and work to repair them. Patricia's transformation from critic to champion hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without setbacks and difficult conversations. But her willingness to examine her own behavior and make genuine changes had created space for all of us to become better versions of ourselves. David's practice of documenting our life had evolved from private observation to shared celebration, creating a record of not just our achievements, but our growth as individuals and as a family. His journal entries had become less about analyzing problems and more about capturing joy, recording the small daily moments that created our life together. And my own journey from feeling invisible to standing on a stage accepting statewide recognition had been about more than professional achievement. It had been about learning to value myself enough to claim space, to speak with confidence, to accept praise gracefully, and to understand that my worth wasn't dependent on others' approval, but enhanced by their recognition. That night, I did start my own journal, beginning with an entry about the evening's celebration and all the people who had helped make it possible. But mostly I wrote about gratitude, for second chances and transformed relationships, for the courage of children who speak truth when adults are too afraid, and for the incredible gift of being truly seen and valued by the people you love most. Looking back now, I can trace our family's transformation to that single moment when Lucas climbed onto a chair and announced that his grandfather had written nice things about his mother. One brave decision by an 8-year-old boy had created ripples that changed everything, proving that sometimes the most powerful truths come from the smallest voices, and that love, when it's allowed to be honest and complete, has the power to transform not just individuals but entire family legacies. 5 years had passed since that life-changing evening at Patricia's dinner table, and I found myself standing in the wings of the Phoenix Convention Center, adjusting my microphone and taking deep breaths before stepping onto the stage. As the Arizona Teacher of the Year, I had been invited to deliver the keynote address at the National Education Association's Southwest Regional Conference, speaking to over 3,000 educators from across 4 states about transformative teaching, practices, and family engagement. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who had once felt too insignificant to speak up at family dinners was now preparing to address thousands of her professional peers. But the journey from silence to voice had been gradual, built on a foundation of support that began with David's private journal entries and Lucas's courageous decision to share them with the world. "You've got this, Mom," came Lucas's voice from behind me. At 13, he had grown tall and confident, inheriting his father's steady presence and what Patricia often called my teacher's heart. He was spending his spring break attending educational conferences with me, fascinated by the intersection of psychology and learning that he was already considering as a potential career path. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, turning to squeeze his hand. "Are Dad and Grandma Pat settled in their seats?" "Front row center, just like always," Lucas replied with a grin. Grandma Pat brought her camera and told everyone sitting near her that her daughter-in-law was the keynote speaker. The pride in his voice when he said daughter-in-law still moved me. Patricia's transformation from critic to champion had been so complete that sometimes it was hard to remember the woman who had once questioned my worthiness. She now introduced me as her daughter-in-law with the same enthusiasm she'd once reserved for Caroline's corporate achievements, or Michael's legal victories. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conference moderator announced from the stage, "please welcome Arizona's Teacher of the Year, Emma Rodriguez Henderson." Walking onto that stage felt like stepping into a spotlight that illuminated not just my individual achievements, but the collective journey our entire family had taken toward understanding what true success actually meant. The applause was warm and welcoming, filled with the kind of recognition that comes from peers who understand the daily challenges and rewards of educational work. 5 years ago, I began, looking out at the sea of faces before me. I was a teacher who felt invisible, even within my own family. I had been working in education for nearly a decade, pouring my heart into every lesson plan and staying late to tutor struggling readers. But I had learned to keep my achievements small and my voice quiet because I believed that was what was expected of me. The audience was already leaning forward, recognizing something familiar in my words. Every educator in that room had probably experienced moments of feeling undervalued or overlooked, whether by administrators, parents, or society at large. But sometimes, I continued, the most powerful transformations begin with the smallest acts of courage. In my case, it was my 8-year-old son who found his father's private journal and decided that the nice things written about me deserved to be heard by everyone, especially by those who had been treating me as though I wasn't quite good enough. I told them the story of that dinner, watching as heads nodded in recognition throughout the audience. I spoke about the power of being truly seen and valued, about how external recognition can help us recognize our own worth, and about the ripple effects that occur when families learn to celebrate each other's authentic contributions rather than comparing them to arbitrary standards of success. The journal entries my husband had been writing weren't just about me, I explained. They were about what he'd learned about love, partnership, and success through our relationship. He had been documenting his own growth as much as mine, recording how my approach to life had influenced his understanding of what really mattered. From the front row, I could see David's familiar smile, the same expression of pride and love he'd worn at countless school events and family celebrations over the years. Beside him, Patricia was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, still emotional, whenever she heard the story of our family's transformation. Education, I told the audience, is fundamentally about seeing potential where others might see problems, about believing in growth even when progress seems slow, and about understanding that every person's contributions have value, even if they don't fit traditional definitions of success. I talked about Sofia Ramirez, who was now in 8th grade and had just been accepted into a prestigious high school arts program. Her bilingual story about seeds growing into flowers had evolved into a collection of poetry that explored themes of identity, belonging, and resilience. She still sent me copies of her work, always including a note thanking me for seeing her potential when she couldn't see it herself. Mrs. Garcia, my adult literacy student, celebrated her 70th birthday last month by reading a speech she had written herself to a room full of family members who had never heard her read aloud before, I shared. Her granddaughter, now 16, credits her grandmother's courage in learning to read as inspiration for her own academic achievements. The audience responded with warm applause, understanding that these individual success stories represented the kind of impact that couldn't be measured by standardized test scores or administrative evaluations. But here's what I want you to remember, I said, my voice growing stronger as I reached the heart of my message. Your work matters, not just because of the skills you teach or the knowledge you impart, but because of the way you see your students. When you recognize potential, when you celebrate growth, when you refuse to give up on a child who has been labeled as difficult or behind, you're doing more than educating. You're transforming lives. I paused, making eye contact with educators throughout the audience. And sometimes, the person whose life gets transformed the most is your own. The speech continued for another 20 minutes, covering research-based teaching strategies and practical approaches to family engagement. But the core message remained constant: the power of being seen, valued, and believed in. Whether you're a struggling student, or an undervalued teacher, or a daughter-in-law who has learned to claim her worth. When I finished speaking, the standing ovation lasted for several minutes. But more meaningful than the applause were the conversations that followed, as teachers approached me throughout the day to share their own stories of transformation and recognition. A middle-aged man from Nevada told me about finally pursuing his master's degree in education after years of being told he wasn't academic enough for advanced study. A young woman from Utah described how she'd learned to advocate for her special needs students after watching their parents fight for appropriate services. An experienced teacher from Colorado shared how she'd started a mentorship program for new educators after realizing how much she'd learned from years of feeling unsupported. Each conversation reinforced what I'd discovered through my own experience. That recognition and support could create exponential ripple effects, inspiring people to reach for achievements they'd never considered possible. That evening, our family gathered for dinner at a restaurant near the convention center, joined by Caroline and her family who had flown in from Denver for the conference. The conversation flowed easily between topics, from Lucas's science fair project on renewable energy to Caroline's latest marketing campaign to David's plans for expanding his consulting business. But it was Patricia who brought up the subject that had been on my mind all day. "Emma, I've been thinking about what you said in your speech about the power of being seen and valued. I want you to know that watching your transformation over these past 5 years has taught me as much about myself as it has about you." She paused, her voice growing thoughtful. "I spent so many years believing that love meant pushing people to be better, correcting their choices, helping them aim higher. But you taught me that real love means seeing people for who they already are and celebrating that, even while supporting their growth." "You've certainly mastered that approach," I said, thinking about how Patricia now interacted with all of us, including Lucas. Instead of pushing him toward predetermined achievements, she encouraged his interests and celebrated his unique perspectives. "It's changed how I relate to everyone," Patricia continued. "Caroline and I have had deeper conversations in the past 2 years than we had in the previous 20. Michael actually asks for my advice now instead of just tolerating my opinions. And Bob says I'm more fun to be around because I'm not constantly trying to improve everyone." David laughed, reaching across the table to squeeze his mother's hand. "You've definitely become more fun to be around, Mom. But more than that, you've become someone we all want to spend time with rather than someone we feel obligated to visit." The comment could have been hurtful, but Patricia received it with the grace she'd developed over years of honest self-reflection. "I'm glad," she said simply. "I'd rather be wanted than needed out of duty." Lucas, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Grandma Pat, do you remember when you used to make those comments about Mom that made her sad?" The directness of his question might have created tension in our family's earlier incarnation, but Patricia answered with the same honesty that had characterized our relationship since that transformative dinner. "I do remember, Lucas," she said. "And I'm ashamed of how I behaved. I was so focused on what I thought your dad needed that I couldn't see what he actually had." "But you learned better," Lucas said matter-of-factly. "That's what Mom always tells her students when they make mistakes. The important thing is learning better and doing better next time." "Your mom is a wise teacher," Patricia replied, smiling at me across the table. "And she raised a wise son." After dinner, as we walked back to our hotel through the warm Phoenix evening, David pulled out his phone to show me something he'd written in his digital journal during my speech that afternoon. "I wrote this while I was watching you on stage. Today," he said, handing me the phone. I wanted to capture what I was feeling in that moment. I read his words, written in the same thoughtful style that had characterized his journaling for years. Today, I watched my wife command the attention of 3,000 educators, sharing her expertise and inspiring others to see their own worth. But what moved me most wasn't her professional achievement, as proud as I am of that. It was seeing her complete comfort with being in the spotlight, her natural confidence in claiming space and speaking with authority. The entry continued. "This is the same woman who used to apologize for taking up too much room at family dinners, who would downplay her achievements to avoid seeming boastful. Watching her transformation has been like watching someone learn to breathe freely after years of holding their breath. She hasn't changed who she is fundamentally, but she's learned to be fully herself without apology. "That's beautiful," I said, handing back his phone. "And accurate. I do feel like I can breathe more freely now." "The best part," David said, wrapping his arm around my shoulders as we walked, "is that your freedom gave the rest of us permission to be more authentic, too. When you stopped shrinking yourself to fit other people's expectations, it created space for all of us to be more honest about who we really are and what we actually value." Lucas, who was walking slightly ahead of us but clearly listening to our conversation, turned around to add his perspective. "Plus, our family is way more fun now that everyone says what they really think, instead of pretending everything is perfect all the time." His observation made both David and me laugh, but it also highlighted an important truth about our family's evolution. The polite distance and careful conversations of our earlier years had given way to genuine connection and honest communication, even when that honesty sometimes involved difficult topics. "Speaking of saying what we really think," I said, "I have something I want to share with both of you." We had reached a small park near our hotel, and I led them to a bench where we could sit and talk privately. The night air was cool and comfortable, filled with the scent of desert flowers and the distant sound of city traffic. "I've been offered a position with the State Department of Education," I said, watching their faces for reactions. "They want me to develop a statewide program for training reading specialists, based on the work I've been doing in our district." David's face lit up immediately. "Emma, that's incredible! What an amazing opportunity!" "It would mean traveling more," I continued, "probably spending several days a month in different districts across Arizona. But it would also mean influencing reading instruction on a much larger scale." "What do you want to do?" Lucas asked, his question cutting straight to the heart of the matter with the clarity that had always characterized his approach to complex situations. I considered his question carefully. 5 years ago, I might have framed my decision around what other people expected of me or what would cause the least disruption to our family routines. But now I had learned to center my own goals and aspirations in my decision-making process. "I want to take the position," I said. "I think I can make a real difference in how reading is taught across the state, and I'm excited about the challenge of working with teachers in rural and urban districts who face very different obstacles." "Then you should absolutely take it," David said without hesitation. "We'll figure out the logistics. This is exactly the kind of opportunity you've been preparing for your entire career." "Are you sure?" I asked, still somewhat amazed by his unconditional support. "It will mean changes for all of us, especially you, David. You'll have more single-parent responsibilities when I'm traveling." "Emma," David said, taking my hands in his, "do you remember what I wrote in my journal about success, meaning becoming the person you're meant to be rather than the person others want you to be?" I nodded, remembering that entry from years earlier. "This position is exactly who you're meant to be," he continued. "A leader in education, someone who influences policy and practice on a large scale. I would be honored to support you in taking this next step." Lucas was grinning at both of us. "Plus, it'll be cool to tell people at school that my mom works for the state government." The simplicity of his pride in my achievement brought tears to my eyes. This was the child who had changed our family's trajectory by recognizing that his mother deserved to be celebrated rather than criticized. Now he was 13, and still my biggest cheerleader, proud of my accomplishments and confident that I deserved every opportunity that came my way. "There's one more thing," I said. "Patricia doesn't know about the job offer yet, but I want to tell her personally. I want her to hear it from me, not secondhand." "She's going to be over the moon," David predicted. "You know how proud she is of everything you've achieved." He was right, of course. When I called Patricia the next morning to share the news, her excitement was immediate and infectious. She peppered me with questions about the position, the travel requirements, and the potential impact on reading education statewide. "Emma, this is exactly what you should be doing," she said, her voice filled with maternal pride. "You have such a gift for helping teachers see their own potential, just like you help students see theirs." "Thank you, Patricia," I said. "Your support means the world to me." "Are you kidding?" she replied. "I get to brag that my daughter-in-law is influencing education policy across Arizona. Do you know how proud that makes me?" The conversation was interrupted by her doorbell ringing, and I could hear her greeting someone in the background. When she returned to the phone, her voice was bubbling with excitement. "That was my neighbor, Mrs. Washington," she said. "I just told her about your new position, and she wants to know if you'd be willing to come speak at her book club about literacy education. Apparently, several of the members are retired teachers who would love to hear about current best practices." I laughed, recognizing Patricia's enthusiasm for sharing my achievements with anyone who would listen. The woman who had once been embarrassed by my career choice now promoted my work with the fervor of a personal publicist. "I'd be happy to speak to her book club," I said. "Just let me know when they'd like to meet." As I hung up the phone, I reflected on the complete transformation of our family dynamics. What had begun with Lucas's innocent decision to share his father's journal entries had evolved into a foundation of mutual support and genuine celebration of each other's achievements. The job with the State Department of Education represented more than just a career advancement for me. It was validation of the journey I'd taken from feeling invisible to becoming a recognized leader in my field. But more than that, it was proof that when people are truly seen and supported, they can achieve things they never imagined possible. That evening, as we prepared to fly back to Phoenix, Lucas pulled out the journal he'd started keeping 2 years earlier. He had filled several notebooks by now, documenting everything from school experiences to family vacations to his observations about the world around him. "What are you writing about today?" I asked, settling beside him in the airport. "Waiting area. I'm writing about how proud I am of you for taking the new job," he said, not looking up from his notebook. "And I'm writing about how different our family is now compared to when I was little." "How is it different?" I asked, curious about his perspective on our evolution. Lucas paused in his writing, considering his answer carefully. "Before, it felt like everyone was pretending to be happy, but really worrying about what other people thought. Now it feels like everyone is actually happy because we can just be ourselves." His observation was so insightful that it took my breath away. At 13, he understood something about authentic relationships that many adults never grasp. That genuine contentment comes from being accepted for who you are, rather than praised for who you're pretending to be. "That's a very wise observation," I told him. "What else are you writing about?" "I'm writing about how reading Dad's journal that time changed everything for our family," Lucas said. "And how sometimes being brave enough to tell the truth is the best thing you can do for people, even if it makes them uncomfortable at first." As our flight was called and we gathered our belongings, I thought about Lucas's words and their broader implications. Truth-telling, whether it came from a child's innocent honesty or an adult's careful courage, had the power to transform relationships and create space for genuine growth. The story of our family's transformation had begun with truth and continued to be shaped by our commitment to honesty, support, and authentic celebration of each other's worth. As I looked forward to the challenges and opportunities of my new position, I carried with me the confidence that comes from being truly known and unconditionally supported by the people who matter most. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the smallest acts of courage, like a young boy climbing onto a chair to share his father's written words about his mother's worth. But the real magic happens in what follows: the willingness to listen, to change, to grow, and to build relationships based on truth rather than pretense. Our family had learned that lesson, and now we carried it forward into every new adventure, secure in the knowledge that love expressed honestly and support given freely could create transformations that rippled far beyond our own lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.